Hey there, it's Pastor Rob here, coming to you from downtown Athens in Greece. I wanted to shoot this video outside so you could get a little look around, but the sights and the sounds of the city are pretty loud, so I'm recording this from inside the apartment where we are staying. Athens is obviously a very, very old city. It dates back thousands of years, actually. Athens is known today for being the cradle of much of Western culture, Western civilization, democracy, culture, art, philosophy, Western thinking has deep roots here in the city of Athens. The city of Athens actually has its origins about 1600 years before the time of Christ. Athens, the story of the founding of Athens is actually kind of an interesting story in Greek mythology anyways. The story goes something like this, and it maybe sheds a little bit of insight into something of the history and the background of the city. The city, as it had been founded, was not yet named, and so the people of Athens decided to hold a competition to see what the city would be named, and more importantly, who the patron god or goddess of the city would be. Back then, most cities had a patron deity that was attached to it and that the people of the city would look to for blessings and favor and so on and so forth. So the story goes like this. The citizens of the city decided to hold this competition between two gods. And they decided that whoever could give the best gift to the citizens of the city would become the city's patron deity. And so the first god who steps up to the plate was a god named Poseidon. And Poseidon was the god of the sea. And he takes his trident, which is kind of like a three-pronged spear, and he sort of smashes it into the ground and brings up all this salt water that then surrounds the city. And that explains why the city is now surrounded by ocean on at least two of the sides of the city. And Poseidon thinks to himself that this would be a great gift to the citizens of Athens because it will allow for trade and commerce and all the resources of the ocean right nearby. And the people are somewhat impressed. And then the next deity that steps up is the goddess Athena. Now, Athena gives the people of Athens an olive tree. And at that point, Poseidon kind of thinks he's got this in the bag, because when you compare the ocean to an olive tree, it's like there's no competition. But as it turns out, the olive tree was much more beneficial than Poseidon realized, because the olive tree allowed for food, because people could eat the olives from it, but it also allowed them to press the olives into oil, and the oil allowed them then to light their lamps so that they could, study at night. And in that sense, then, it's kind of a side note there, but that's how one of the ways that light became associated with wisdom. But the people of Athens are just thoroughly impressed with this gift of the olive tree. And so they proclaim Athena to be the patron goddess of the city of what was yet unnamed, but then they named the city after her, the city of Athens. Now, of course, that's a narrative, and there's different variations on that story, but the point is that the goddess Athena became the patron deity of the city of Athens. Later today, we're going to see the temple that they built to Athena. It's a building that no doubt most of you have seen before, at least in pictures. It's the Parthenon of Athens, and that was a temple to the goddess Athena. And inside that temple was a huge sculpture, statue, or idol of Athena that was all covered in gold and very well ornamented. And that's going to come into play later on when we look at Paul's engagement here in the city of Athens. The statue of Athena was carved in ivory and clothed in gold and had gold earrings and necklace and bracelet and so on. Incidentally, just a quick word about the Parthenon. We're going to visit there later today, and I'll take you on a little tour. What you see there is actually not the original Parthenon. The original was destroyed in about the 16th century when the Turks, the Venetians, came and were attacking the Turks who were holed up in the Parthenon, and they shot a cannonball at the Parthenon. And as it turns out, the Parthenon was filled with gunpowder and it exploded, and you can imagine that it was quite a big explosion. So the Parthenon that you see today, that we know today, it's a rebuilt version of it. Now, all the stones in that are parts of the original and so on and so forth, but it's technically not the same structure. Paul comes to the city of Athens probably in about the year 51 AD, and that itself, Paul's engagement into the city of Athens is really striking. By the time Paul visits, Athens was way past its cultural heyday. Really, Athens was at its sort of high point in about 300 to 500 years before the time of Christ. That's when Athens was the center of all civilization. But by the time we get into the New Testament era, the Romans are really the culture that's in charge. But Greek philosophy still sticks around. Greek philosophy is still highly influential, and so Greek culture and Athens was still a pretty influential city. Now, you've got to keep in mind that when Paul visits this city, Paul is he was steeped in Jewish culture, Jewish law, Jewish religion, Jewish worldview, which really was very cautious about pagan worlds and pagan culture. And so when Paul enters the city of Athens, it's a really sharp contrast. Here you get someone deeply rooted in Jewish and biblical, we'd say today, biblical worldview, and yet he's engaged in this city that is, by most accounts, a very cosmopolitan and even very pagan city. Paul comes to Athens not necessarily planning to come there originally. He was in Thessaloniki, and he was essentially chased out of Thessaloniki. He was not permitted to stay there because he was sort of, as we talked about in our previous video, he was causing trouble. He was stirring up trouble in Thessaloniki, and so he decided it would be better for him to leave after he'd been there a couple months. And he decided that it would probably be better for him to leave. So he comes to Athens, and he's very concerned for the Thessalonian Christians. They were very young Christians. They were very new. And so out of his concern for them, he actually sends Timothy back to Thessalonica. And he remains here, Paul remains here in Athens. And so he has some time, you might say some time to kill. Now, we're not talking a couple hours, we're talking days and weeks. And he's probably hoping to meet up with some of the other missionaries while he's here in Athens. And his time in Athens is marked by a real concern for the Thessalonian Christians and for the believers that he sees there. One little, this is maybe just a little side note, and then we'll get into the actual tour of the city. I bring this up because it's something so common today, but when this whole idea of expelling people from cities was pretty common in those days. When you had a teacher or a leader or someone who came into prominence and the rest of the people didn't like the person, what they would do is they would take the name of that person that they wanted to expel from the city, and they would write that name on a piece of pottery. And the name of that pottery, the name of that kind of, it's like a broken piece of pottery, was called an ostraca. And you can hear in that the English word for ostracize. So what they were trying to do was to ostracize the person from their city. And I bring that up because that's really an ancient version of cancel culture. We sometimes talk about that today. When someone makes a public mistake or they say something that's unpopular, then we ostracize them, or in today's language, we cancel culture them, or we cancel them. That's actually nothing new. So Paul comes to this city because he's been ostracized from Thessaloniki. He's concerned for the young church back in Thessalonica. He's got some time, and so what does he do? He takes a walk through the Agora, through the marketplace.
Now the Agora is just that. It's a Greek word. It means marketplace. Now, when you and I hear the word marketplace, we typically think of a place that we would go to buy food or maybe household goods. Maybe we think of a farmer's market. But The Agora in Paul's day was much more than that. In fact, it was more a place for the exchange of ideas. Remember that Athens was the center of philosophy. This is where Socrates and Plato and Aristotle all really made their home. And so in the Agora, the marketplace, this is where different philosophers came to present their ideas, to discuss and to debate the different thoughts that they had, and to invite people to adopt their way of thinking. The Agora was also a religious place. Everywhere you'd look, you'd see maybe temples or monuments or idols that were meant to be worshipped. And in Athens, the Agora is right there at the base of the world-famous Parthenon. So right beneath the Parthenon was the marketplace. In Acts chapter 17, Paul enters into the Agora of Athens. We're walking through the Agora now, and this is how it looks today. These may very well be the very same path that Paul himself would have taken in Acts chapter 17. You can just imagine him walking perhaps from booth to booth or from person to person, and he's taking note of what they're saying, what their different ideas are, what their different philosophies are. He no doubt notices that people are buying and selling. They're discussing ideas, they're discussing thoughts, they're doing business. But what really stands out to Paul is the many different idols that he sees. He sees that there are gods that have been manufactured for just about every different deity imaginable. But not only that, he even sees a statue or an idol dedicated to an unknown god. And Paul's response to this is to be deeply troubled in spirit. Paul sees behind these philosophies, behind these worldviews, and behind these many different idols, he sees a deep spiritual need. And so he begins to discuss, he begins to engage people. To the Jews who were devout, God-believing people, he goes to the synagogue and he talks with them. Stoics were moral and disciplined people. They believed that the key to the good life was being disciplined and being master over your desires and your urges. And the Epicureans were the people who believed that life is short and you need to have fun. But Paul sees behind all of this the need for Jesus, and that's what he presents to them as he walks through the marketplace. The philosophers and the people listening to Paul are curious. They want to hear more about what Paul is saying, and so they make plans to bring him up to Mars Hill, or what is known as the Areopagus. Before we get into what Paul says there, I need to tell you a little bit about the Parthenon. Parthenon is not mentioned in Acts chapter 17, but it looms large in the background of Paul's message. You've seen the Parthenon before. It's this temple structure that was built on top of a large mountain. It was a temple built for the goddess Athena. It was a place where her statue would have been built, and the people would have come to worship Athena. There were other temples as well on that same structure where other gods, lesser gods, were also worshipped. So this was a place of worship. It was a sacred site, a religious site, overlooking the Agora in Athens. This is the Areopagus. This is sometimes called Mars Hill. It's a rocky outcropping just next to the Parthenon. It's a place where people were brought to give an explanation for their beliefs, to be sort of put on trial to explain why they believed what they did. And you are standing where Paul's audience would have been standing, and you are seeing what they would have seen as Paul delivered his famous Mars Hill sermon in Acts chapter 17.
This is an important place because this is where the Apostle Paul, in about the year 51, he delivered his famous sermon to the Athenians. The Acropolis is really just a rocky outcrop here. It's about 100 meters above the ground, above the lowest part of the city of Athens. The significance of this is that in Acts chapter 17, this is exactly where the Apostle Paul is brought to give an answer for some of the things that he was teaching earlier in the marketplace. When he was asked to give his defense of what he was saying, there's a couple things that are really significant. One of the things that Paul says is, if you read in Acts 17, he says that our God does not live in a temple made with human hands. Now, if you look right behind me, what do you see? You see a temple made with human hands. Paul would have said these things to make a very, very clear point over and against the goddess of Athena and the many other Greek gods. The other thing that he said was that our God is not made of gold or silver or any other kind of stone. And that's important because the goddess inside that temple, it's not there anymore, of course, but inside that goddess would have been an enormous statue of the goddess Athena, and it would have been carved out of ivory, and it would have been overlaid with gold. And so what Paul is doing is he's here on the Acropolis, here in Mars Hill. He is giving he's showing that the Christian God is over and against. He's better than the stone gods who live in man-made temples. He's showing that our God actually dwells in all the earth, and the whole temple, the whole earth is his dwelling place, and he is near to us. And then he goes on and he appeals to the Greek poets, and he tries to show from even how Greek philosophy, Greek poetry was exposing a longing that ultimately only Christianity could answer.
So here we are. Athenian culture valued sophistication. They valued ideas. They valued the intellect. They valued rhetoric and poetry and theater. It was a cosmopolitan city, even if it was past its prime. And Paul brings the gospel here, and as he does so, he shows us how the Christian message doesn't shy away from the cultural centers of the day, doesn't shy away from the cultural ideas, but it engages them. Paul knows his audience. He knows how they think, and he brings the good news of Jesus to them in a way that points them to the one who can satisfy their ultimate longings. Thanks for watching this episode of Walking in the Footsteps of Faith. We'll see you next time as we make our way towards Corinth.